You are listening to part 28 of our series, 7 Medicines, The Wise Woman Way, with Susan Weed at Time Monk Radio. Hello, Susan. Welcome back to Time Monk Radio.
Hey, Gemini. What did you think about what we were talking about last week about alternative medicine and stimulus and sedation?
I think it's fascinating, as all your information is. And I was thinking to myself, what do I do that is stimulation versus sedation? Just kind of going over stuff in my own mind.
Right. Well, interestingly enough, it's not versus.
Or and.
Yeah, because many stimulants become sedatives, huh?
Yes.
For instance, alcohol.
Yes, that's a good example.
Really good example, right? Many people say, I just like to have a little alcohol. Makes me more sociable to go out, party. But then eventually you drink so much alcohol that you just pass out. So stimulant, sedation generally come together. And this is another thing that is astonishing to many people, because what seems most obvious to us is that it's either a stimulant or a sedative. I mentioned very briefly valerian root last week, that if you went into a pharmacy and said, do you have any herbs for sale, they'd probably have valerian root for sale. And interestingly enough, although valerian root is well known as a sedative, approximately a third of the people who take valerian are going to be stimulated by it.
I did not know that.
Yeah, exactly. And they are not going to go to sleep. They're going to stay up all night playing solitaire or whatever it is they do when they can't go to sleep. Kava kava is another well-known sedative. It's used in Germany as a nerve sedative, a pain sedative, great many things. And yet, at the Herbalist Ball, at the International Herb Symposium, we use kava kava so we can dance all night. Right, an herb that's classically thought of as a sedative, and yet we use it as a stimulant.
That reminds me, there's some sleep aids that sometimes I'll take, and they actually do not help me sleep. I think one of them is wild lettuce. Is that a sedative, stimulant
because
kind of thing?
Stimulation and sedation are not two different things, they're two sides of the same coin.
Okay.
And that's why they are the fifth medicine.
Okay.
The two of them together. So I promised you that we would actually kind of look at this and see what are we talking about here, because I must say that at this point it gets complicated. But up until now, it's been, interesting and complex, but not really complicated. When we start to really look at herbs and how they work as stimulants and sedatives, it can get enormously complicated. Not just because there's a whole bunch of herbs that are stimulants and sedatives, but because we can choose a great variety of different ways of preparing those herbs. So when you say that you take wild lettuce and you think that it could very well be stimulating, what form of wild lettuce are you taking?
It was a tincture that someone had made for me.
And the tincture is a form of the wild lettuce, and it will have a different action than, say, taking a tea of the wild lettuce. And that's just one very simple difference we have. But there are also different parts of the plant.
Yes, I think it was aerial parts of it, but I can't be certain now that I say
So it
that.
probably was the aerial parts of the plant. And many wild lettuces are biennials. So the tincture can be made of either the aerial parts of the plant or from the sap of the plant. And if the aerial parts are picked in the first year, they're not going to have very much sap in them. So we need the aerial parts from the second year plants, if it's a biennial wild lettuce, as most of them are. And again, we could also use the sap from the flowering stalk from that second year. So we can see how very quickly it gets complicated, right?
Indeed.
When I was writing down there, I started asking around the men I knew, do you take saw palmetto? I didn't even bother to ask them if they had prostate problems because I figured they would just say no. But, and I wasn't really interested in their problems anyhow. I was interested to know, are you taking saw palmetto, and is it being beneficial to you? And the answers, fell out pretty clearly. The men who were taking saw palmetto capsules felt that saw palmetto did little or nothing. The men who were taking saw palmetto tincture felt that saw palmetto was a true ally for them. I then asked all the men who told me they were taking saw palmetto in capsules to switch over to tincture. And I would estimate that about 90% of them said, oh, now it works. So I often say that the difference between folklore and herbal medicine lies in having the answers to 4 questions. What part of the plant are we talking about? When have we harvested it? How have we prepared it? And, one we haven't yet mentioned, what dose are we taking? We just saw that the effects of alcohol are dose-dependent, aren't they?
Yes.
Have 1 glass of champagne, you'll be the life of the party. Drink the whole bottle, it'll be the death of you. Not literally, I'm talking symbolically, right?
Sure.
But all things, and especially when we're working with substances that are sedative and stimulants, the effects are dose-dependent. I was talking with the apprentices the other morning about herbs that relieve pain, and I mentioned that Juliet de Berkeley-Levy would use tea of the heads of poppies to calm teething babies and fretful babies. And if you, Gemini, or you listeners are going, wait, poppies, is that opium? Well, yes, it's true. But tea of the seed heads is not. As a matter of fact, you could go to the store and buy a bottle of poppy seeds. It's perfectly legal to sell poppy seeds. You could dump that whole bottle of poppy seeds into a pan with water and boil it up, and you can drink that, and that would be sedative. Because, yeah, it's from poppy. And I'm told that football players are not allowed to eat, like, poppy seed buns because they would show up as having ingested a narcotic. Not allowed to eat lettuce because it's going to show up as having ingested a narcotic. Again, not just the wild lettuce. The regular lettuce has enough sedative constituents in it to show up on a drug test. We're not just saying that we have to turn these into pharmaceutical things. Even at food levels, we can have stimulating and sedating effects. So let's look first at some sedatives and have some idea of how we might use these. And I'm taking information now that is in my correspondence course, The Spirit and Practice of the Wise Woman Tradition. And the Spirit and Practice course starts you out with exercises so that you can easily identify the scientific tradition of medicine, the heroic tradition of medicine, and the wise woman tradition of medicine, and become comfortable in these traditions. And then it moves into working with the 7 medicines. And I give my students a list of sedatives, and I ask them to order them. In other words, which would be the strongest, which would be the least strong. And I also then ask them, if you wanted to make this stronger, what could you do? If you wanted to make this less strong, what could you do? So I'm just going to read the list to you, and then we'll dip into it and really start to work with it. Aspirin, catnip tincture, skullcap tincture, opium, kava kava, ibuprofen, beer, chamomile tea, St. John's wort tincture, poppy head tea, oat straw infusion, mullein flowers infusion, shepherd's purse tincture, acupuncture, motherwort tincture, hot water, hops tea, plantain, massage, valerian pills, oat straw bath, marshmallow root tea, and passion flower tincture. So that's a lot of different sedatives, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah. And some of them, aspirin, ibuprofen, hot water, beer, right, opium. Some of them are, absolutely things that people think about, and some of them, oat straw bath, passion flower tincture, might be things that people wouldn't necessarily think about, and then kind of the in-between ones, opium, right, chamomile tea, these are somewhat in people's minds. So we would say that oat straw infusion is the mildest of these sedatives. In fact, that it is so mild that it is part of my nourishing herbal infusions, which are part of lifestyle medicine. This is not even really in this medicine at all. But as I said, I want us to really see the whole sweep of this. And so we start with one that isn't in the fifth medicine, that is a fourth medicine, which is oat straw infusion, and acknowledge that oat straw infusion has a nourishing and very, very mild ability to help us stay calm. You've heard me talk about several times about the woman that I used to work with who was so nervous, and we worked in a store with a little bell on the door, and every time the bell would ring, she would just about jump out of her skin. And the way that I got her calmed down was through bringing oat straw infusion to work, which I drank, and of course offering her some. And that was enough to strengthen and tonify and nourish her nervous system so that it calmed down. Certainly I could have used, well, what do we have at the other end? At the other end, we're going to put opium, aren't we? Opium is classified as a drug. It's not made in a laboratory. It's made in a plant. Definitely addictive, but available on the black market, certainly not freely available, and yet nonetheless available to people. And that's at the other end of this list of sedatives. Oat straw, safe enough to be used with anyone at any time to help them be calmer. Opium, the kind of thing that we would use only in an extreme circumstance. And opium, and then, of course, its derivatives, morphine and heroin, which take us right into the next river, the pharmaceutical river. And these very strong drugs, morphine and heroin, are derived directly from opium, and so they're kind of the next step over there. We would also, of course, have to say, hey, Susan, you put in some ringers there. Aspirin, although it is a sedative, is definitely got to be there in that sixth medicine. That's pharmaceutical medicine, and you're right. And ibuprofen, again, you're right. These are in the sixth medicine. They're not really here in the fifth medicine at all. And the current news, fairly big news, is that not only do Many of the pain-relieving drugs have detrimental effects on the kidneys and the liver, which has been common knowledge for quite a long time, but they also appear to increase the risk of heart attack and stroke as well. As a matter of fact, product labels are going to be changed because of the growing evidence that we have that these pharmaceutical sedatives have much more detrimental effects on our bodies than we had thought. And so, again, I hope that I'm making clear that there is a distinction between something such as opium, which I'm certainly not suggesting is good for us, but nonetheless is not anywhere near as bad for us as the pharmaceutical drugs, the morphine and the heroin. Not as bad for us as the pharmaceutical drugs like aspirin or ibuprofen either. Where would we put chamomile? Many people in doing this assignment choose chamomile as the mildest of the sedatives. However, chamomile contains a volatile oil, and volatile oils can have very strong effects on us. So if we make chamomile tea from dried chamomile that doesn't have much oil in it, and we brew it very, very briefly, perhaps we even use a chamomile tea bag, then it would be certainly a milder sedative. But we need to recognize that many people would use fresher chamomile, be sure they got good quality chamomile, brew it for a little longer, and now we're actually starting to get to a problematic area with that chamomile. When picking wild chamomile in Holland, I was warned that if I brewed my chamomile tea made from fresh chamomile for more than 3 minutes, I would wind up in the hospital. This is certainly not a sedative that we can say is as safe as oat straw. What is nearly as safe as oat straw is motherwort tincture. In fact, many herbalists would not even consider motherwort tincture much of a sedative. They would consider it a calmative. Again, this is one of those herbs that we might say, tries to see if it can straddle that great chasm, right? Can I, motherwort, help to tonify you and at the same time calm you down? Certainly, motherwort tincture has that ability to do both things. That can be taken right at the acute time to help bring calmness, to calm down anxiety, to really counter an anxiety attack, and the more it's used, the more tonified and the healthier we get. So again, it's hard to see that there's ever a addictive quality to motherwort, but of course we can always choose to overuse something. So often I would make that choice then to use oat straw infusion over a longer time, or to use motherwort tincture at the acute or short time, and to leave the chamomile tea for later on. In fact, the oat straw bath that I mentioned is a wonderful way to calm people down. I learned this in Switzerland. And there they call it a hay bath. They just go out into the meadow and they harvest armloads of wild oats and all the other herbs that are growing out there, and have special bathtubs not connected to the plumbing. Do not let herbs go down your drain. You'll have to wind up having a good time with the plumber. Protect your drain. So they have special tubs, and they literally throw armloads of what we call hay and wild oats into the bathtub, fill it up with hot water, and plunk the person down there, especially if the person has been traumatized, if they're freaking out, if they really need to be calmed and sedated. The oat straw bath will do it. We talked about hot water. We talked about hot water being able to calm us down. So here we are using that calming ability of the oats along with the hot water in a bath. This is not going to be as tonifying as drinking the oat straw infusion. But it is going to work faster. Often, when we are stimulating and sedating, what we really need is to work fast. We're not going to say, yes, there you are, bleeding to death after having given birth. We'll give you some nettle infusion for the next 2 weeks and ought to stop that. No, that's absurd. We're going to walk in with shepherd's purse tincture and stop that bleeding right then. Then we can give that woman some nettle infusion. Shepherd's purse tincture is a sedative of blood flow. So I've been talking about sedatives and stimulants as though they kind of sedated or stimulated everything in our bodies. That's not really quite true. I've somewhat focused in on the nervous system with oat straw, but here we have shepherd's purse, which is a direct sedative to bleeding in the body and doesn't sedate us in any other way. I also very much like mullein flowers as a sedative. In fact, the entire flowering stalk of the mullein and the root of the first-year plant is an interesting sedative. I could have added tincture of mullein root to my list of sedatives, but it's not available commercially. You'd have to know it yourself, and very few herbalists use it. So it's confusing enough to try to figure this out without my throwing in something that is really in very little use. And yes, I believe that one of the reasons that mullein is so effective in helping people who have asthma and allergies is because of the sedative effect, that it not only goes into the lung tissue and helps the lung tissue, but it sedates the nervous system, and so helps that information get through better to the lungs. Passion flower tincture from the fresh flowering parts of the passion flower, which includes the flowers, leaves, and the vines of it, is another one of those plants that longs to be a tonic. And it can be used wisely, used well. Passion flower tincture could be used on a daily basis as a tonic. However, it can also be used in a much larger single dose to really have a sedative effect. Remember our 4 questions. We're looking at what part of the plant, what time it was harvested, how we prepared it, and the dose. And the dose can actually, with certain herbs, say, I can use that in a smaller dose as a tonic, or I can use that in a larger dose to have a direct sedative effect. Many people say, beer, why'd you put beer on there? I said, well, I didn't want to just put alcohol, so I chose an alcohol, which is beer. And many people are aware of the sedative effects of beer, but I also want to point out that beer also stimulates the urinary tract. It's not just the beer that is coming out. There's actually a direct effect on urination from drinking beer. So we can certainly see that beer isn't a drug. It's not near pharmaceutical medicine, and is probably about as strong as chamomile tea for many people in terms of sedating and calming down. Skullcap tincture is another kind of middle of the road, really powerful. It can be used in tiny doses to calm, or it can be used in quite large doses to put people to sleep and write out kachunga, right, as beer will do too, and as hops tea will also do. Hops tea is a wonderful way to put people to sleep with very little side effect from using that. The stronger herbs like valerian again, we have the opportunity to say, I'm going to use the flower of valerian, which is very mildly sedative. I'm going to use the root of valerian, which is much more strongly sedative. I'm going to use valerian root in capsules, which is probably the most powerful way to use it. Or I'm going to make a valerian root tincture, which is, to my mind, a nicer way to use that. So again, we can't just say, oh, valerian is a safe sedative because it's an herb, because there are various parts of it we can use. There are various methods of preparing it, and there are various doses that we can take. Plus, we've added in that there's biochemical variation within human bodies as well. Catnip tincture is a wonderful sedative. And you think about your cat. People say, catnip, is that a sedative? I said, well, here again, we can see very, very clearly that sedating and stimulating go together. When my cat gets into the catnip, and she's allowed to get into the catnip anytime she wants to, although it's in a building where she has to follow me in to get into it, of course, her first reaction is chase that imaginary mouse, chase that imaginary tail, crawl up the walls, be very stimulated, and then crash and go to sleep. Catnip tincture works in almost exactly that way with hyperactive children. And we think about what kind of drug are hyperactive children usually given.
Ritalin, usually, aren't they?
Which is what?
So it's supposed to be a sedative. I think it has an opposite effect on some people, though.
No, it's a stimulant.
Oh, it is a stimulant. Okay.
It is a stimulant, and it's given because when you give a hyperactive child a stimulant, it causes sedation.
Oh, okay.
we're not talking stimulation versus sedation. We're talking stimulation and sedation living together. And it's our wisdom and our skill that allows us to get what we want from the herb, from the drug, from the substance, from the technique in this situation at this time in order to relieve that pain, relieve that trauma, calm that person down, help them get to sleep, whatever it is that we want that sedative for. And catnip tincture is not the kind of thing that many people think about, but it is wonderfully useful. And if you have catnip growing where you are, it's a possibility that you can make your catnip tincture yourself. I prefer to make it from the flowering top of the catnip, but any part of the catnip will work. Could you make tincture from dried catnip? Well, there again, we have a different remedy. It does not seem to have the same effect on hyperactive children. It is, however, more sedative. You remember my talking about the apprentice who loved using fresh catnip tea because it sedated her menstrual cramps. Her menstrual cramps were just gone when she drank fresh tea of catnip. And then she got worried because she was going off on a trip. She didn't know if she'd have fresh catnip tea, and she knew she was going to menstruate. She decided to dry catnip and roll it up and smoke it. And she found that it worked very effectively as a sedative when it was rolled up and smoked as well. When I wrote this list, I was not able to put on my list marijuana. But marijuana is now a plant that we can begin to talk about again, as it is illegal in at least some states. And marijuana tincture is coming on very, very strongly as a wonderful ally for people with all kinds of pain. It can be a sedative, certainly, and it can also simply be pain relief with little sedative attached to it, and that's because there are almost an infinite variety of strains of marijuana. And so we have added yet another complication or variation to a complicated and varied subject, and that is that not only is it the part of the marijuana, the time when we pick it, the way we prepare it, and the dose that we use, but the individual strain of the plant that we are actually using. Well, I hope that this has been of some direct help to you in terms of understanding sedative herbs and what you might want to use. And in that hope, I am going to roll this talk over too, and when we get together next week, we will look at some herbal stimulants and see on the ground, hands-on, how do we use those as well? Once again, I've run us right out of time, and it's such a delight being here with you. Green blessings, everyone.
Thanks so much, Susan. This concludes part 28 of our series, The 7 Medicines, The Wise Woman Way, with Susan Weed at Time Monk Radio.